Hey guys, welcome to the Artemis Defense Institute. My name is Stephen Lieberman. I'm one of the co-owners of the Artemis Defense Institute. In this video series, we're talking about purchasing a firearm, and in these videos, these subsequent videos, we're going into the specifics of some of the requirements that are necessary. This particular video is going to be focusing in on where you should buy your gun. And basically, for all intents and purposes, you pretty much have two choices. You can go to a gun store or you can buy it online. Now, there is a third, we'll call it possibility, and that is you can buy it through what's called a private party transfer from somebody that you already know that has a firearm that's looking to sell one. And when I use online as a possibility of where you could get a firearm, I'm using it in an extremely broad sense. That could be online from a traditional marketplace that sells firearms. That could be online in a discussion group where there's a classified section where you're making arrangements through somebody. Basically, all firearms transfers, with some very, very limited exceptions, which are too small to really go into detail here in this video, all firearms transfers in California have to go through what's called an FFL. An FFL is a federal firearms licensee. All gun stores that sell guns are FFLs. They're regulated by the federal government. There's a secondary set of regulations that come from the California state government. Those are referred to as California firearms dealers, okay? So if you're a gun store in California, essentially you're operating underneath two rubrics of regulations. A federal regulation under the FFL, and then a state regulation under what's called the CFD. At the Artemis Defense Institute, we don't sell guns per se, but we are an FFL and we do have our CFD number. So guns can be transferred here, and we do that for clients where people will send guns to us and then go through what we had talked about in an earlier video, the dealer record of sale, where we actually go through the registration process. So people come in, they take an FSC test here, or they go through some of our classes and they say, hey, you know what, I want to buy a gun. I just went over to the gun store and, oh my gosh, it was really crowded. There's a catastrophe going on. Everybody wants to buy a gun right now, and frankly, I just didn't want to wait in line. I remember seeing some politician stating on the news that it was just as easy, or if not easier, to buy a Glock than it is to buy a book. So you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply go online, go to the functional equivalent to Amazon for guns. I'm going to buy a Glock and have it shipped to my home. No, that doesn't work. And in fact, the online retailer would not allow that firearm to ship to anybody other than an FFL. So what does the FFL actually look like? Well, this is a copy of our FFL, okay? It's available on our website, and if you wanted to purchase a gun online, you would pay for it, and in the shipping section, it would ask you, what FFL do you want it to ship to? Now, Artemis is listed on a number of websites, but if, let's say you had gone to one that we weren't familiar with, and you said, I wanted to ship to the Artemis Defense Institute, they would then ask you for a copy of two things. Number one, our FFL, which you would then just take off of our website and send to them via PDF. Also, they would want our CFD number. And again, in California, we have each centralized firearm dealer has a unique individual CFD number. Ours happens to be 22229, okay? So in any event, you would then PDF this document over along with our CFD number, and then that retailer would then ship the firearm to our location. You would then set up an appointment to come in and go through the dealer record of sale, which, as you remember from our previous video, you'd have to bring in your copy of your driver's license, utility bills, things like that, and you go a firearm safety card. You go through that entire process with a 4473. You also could theoretically go through what's called a private party transfer. Now, private party transfer, you have identified a seller, whether you found them online or you found them through a neighbor or you found them through a friend or whatever it was. You've identified a seller that has a firearm and they are willing to sell it to you. You cannot simply give them cash, take possession of the gun, and be done with it. Okay, that's an illegal transfer. The only way that you can legally go through a transfer would be to meet that seller at an FFL. Now, all FFLs must engage in private party transfers, okay? So you would show up typically by appointment. The firearm would be inspected between the buyer and the seller. The financial agreements would be consummated. And then the FFL would take possession of the gun. At that point, both the buyer and seller would fill out paperwork, including the 4473. The firearm would then be drozed to the buyer. And the buyer would have to leave the firearm with the FFL for the 10-day waiting period. At the end of 10 days, they could then acquire the gun from the FFL, assuming that the transaction was approved by the California Department of Justice. So the big question then comes in, should I buy it online or should I go to a gun store? Well, my answer to that is if you're going to purchase your very first firearm, I would highly, highly encourage you to go through a gun store, okay? For a number of different reasons. Number one, you've got somebody there who can walk you through the process. Number two, it's structured. You know exactly what you're getting. And candidly, they have guns there that you can look at, you can play with, you can, decide whether you like one versus the other and everything else. They also have, and every gun store has this, they have used guns for sale. Now, this is a little bit of a caveat to what I normally tell people. I normally tell people for your first gun, I recommend getting a Glock 19. Now, I'm not a huge Glock guy. I carry a 1911 or a SIG P365, but that notwithstanding, I think the Glock 19 is an excellent starting off place for the vast majority of people out there. That being said, a lot of times I'll have people that come into the shop that tell me that they only want to buy a new gun. They don't want to buy a used gun because they don't know where the gun came from. They don't know the quality of the gun, blah, 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 blah. That is not the case with firearms, guys. Look at used guns. Used guns are all, a reputable gun store is not going to sell a firearm that is, patently damaged and susceptible to a catastrophic failure. Okay, all of those guns have been inspected by the gun store and the gunsmith. And guns typically don't just go bad, okay? So, there could be some real gems inside the used gun rack there. It's definitely something you want to look at. And if you're just buying online, you're not going to be able to make those kinds of determinations. I would suggest that if you look to buy guns online, that comes later. Once you become more familiar with firearms, once you become more familiar with the gun culture, and once you effectively decide that there's a specific type of firearm that you want. Understand too, a lot of people come in and they tell me, well, I'm just planning on buying one gun. I can never imagine owning more than one. Those of you who are watching this video that have been in the gun culture for a while, you know how cute that statement is. Reality is, once you own a firearm, they become like rabbits. They start multiplying in your safe. So, again, I highly recommend you go to a gun store for your first gun, unless you have a family member or some very, very close friend that is willing to sell you a very specific gun. In that case, you can set up a private party transfer. If you absolutely know that you simply want to buy that Glock 19 and have it shipped to an FFL, you absolutely could go to one of the many firearms retailer online stores. Typically, we suggest people go to riflegear.com. They seem to have one of the better selections. Buy the gun and have it shipped to an FFL. But under no circumstances in California, do you engage in a transfer of a firearm between one person and another without going through an FFL. That's very, very important. Anyways, as always, I want you to train constantly, train consistently, train repetitively, and train with purpose. And above all else, stay safe.